For 6 years, police officers stood on John Wayne Gacy's front porch. The bodies were 4 feet beneath their shoes, 26 of them packed into a crawl space measuring roughly 40 feet by 40, under a quiet brick ranch house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, Norwood Park Township, on the northwest edge of Chicago. Neighbors came to his barbecues and stood on that same ground. Politicians shook his hand in that living room. Children laughed at his clown act a few miles away. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy was reported, investigated, arrested, and in one case convicted. And the killing never stopped. How does a man get flagged by law enforcement again and again in 3 separate jurisdictions and still bury 33 young men without anyone connecting a single thread? That is the question this case forces us to answer. And the answer is not that Gacy was a genius. The answer is far more uncomfortable. The system looked directly at him more than once and decided he could not possibly be what he was. Because John Wayne Gacy was, by every visible measure, exactly the kind of man a 1970s suburb trusted. A successful contractor, a Democratic precinct captain photographed with the First Lady of the United States, a Jaycee's Man of the Year, a registered clown named Pogo who performed at children's hospitals and neighborhood parties. When Cook County investigators finally broke through the concrete of his crawl space in December 1978, they were not uncovering the secret life of a drifter or a recluse. They were excavating the foundation of a man the community had chosen to celebrate. They lived among us. They always do. But few cases in American criminal history demonstrate that sentence with the mathematical precision of this one, because in this case we can count the exact number of times he should have been stopped. There were at least 6. We will examine every one of them. But to understand how the mask was built, we have to go back to where it was forged, a 2-flat on Chicago's North Side, decades before the first shovel of dirt was turned in that crawl space. Because the profile of John Wayne Gacy does not begin with a murder. It begins with a boy trying, desperately and without success, to be loved by his father. John Wayne Gacy, Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, St. Patrick's Day, at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, the second of 3 children and the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robertson. The family was working class, Catholic, Polish and Danish in ancestry, and outwardly unremarkable. The father worked as a machinist. The mother worked as a homemaker and later a pharmacist's assistant, and by every surviving account, she was warm toward her children. The household's pathology flowed from one source: John Stanley Gacy, a hard-drinking World War I veteran who came home from work, retreated to the basement to drink alone, and emerged in the evenings transformed. The elder Gacy's abuse followed a pattern that criminal psychologists would later find deeply significant, because it was not random violence. It was targeted humiliation. He beat his wife in front of the children. He struck his son with a razor strop for perceived failures. But the physical violence was, in the assessment of nearly everyone who later studied the case, less formative than the verbal campaign that accompanied it. John Stanley Gacy called his son stupid. He called him a sissy. He compared him unfavorably to the neighborhood boys who played sports and got their hands dirty. When young John showed interest in cooking with his mother or gardening, the father read it as evidence of weakness and said so repeatedly in front of others. One phrase recurs across interviews, court records, and Gacy's own later statements to psychiatrists. His father told him over and over that he would grow up to be a he-she, not a man, something in between, something shameful. The boy's response was not rebellion, it was pursuit. This is the detail that separates Gacy's childhood from the standard template of abuse. He never stopped trying to win his father's approval. He took on odd jobs, he organized, he performed. Decades later, on death row, Gacy would still describe his father in terms that mixed fear with longing, and he would tell interviewers that his father never once said he was proud of him. Forensic psychologists who examined Gacy before his trial identified this dynamic as foundational. A child who learned, before the age of 10, that his authentic self was unacceptable and that survival required the construction of a performed self, a false front, a mask that worked. The body gave him additional reasons to hide. Gacy was overweight, unathletic, and chronically unwell. He was born with a congenital heart condition that kept him out of the sports his father valued. At age 11, he was struck in the head by a swing, an accident that caused a blood clot on the brain, undiagnosed until he was 16, which triggered blackouts throughout his adolescence. His father's interpretation of the blackouts was consistent with everything else. He accused the boy of faking them for attention. At 17, Gacy was diagnosed with a non-specific heart ailment and hospitalized repeatedly. He would later exaggerate and weaponize his health problems for sympathy his entire life, a manipulation tactic learned, like most of his tactics, in his father's house, where illness was the only condition under which the beatings paused. There was one more element in the foundation, and it is one Gacy disclosed only years later. Around the age of 9, he was molested by a family friend, a contractor, who took the boy on truck rides and abused him. Gacy never told his father. His stated reason, given to psychiatrists decades afterward, is one of the most clinically revealing sentences in his entire file. He believed his father would blame him. By 9 years old, the arithmetic of his inner life was already fixed. Shame was his fault, secrecy was safety, and authority figures were not protection, but threat. School records show the predictable result. Gacy attended 4 different high schools, performed poorly, and dropped out in his senior year without graduating. In 1962, at age 20, after another explosive period with his father, he did what runaways do. He left. He drove west with no plan and ended up in Las Vegas, where he took the only job he could find, as a janitor and then an attendant at the Palm Mortuary. He worked around the dead. He slept, by his own account, on a cot behind the embalming room. What happened in that mortuary is known only from Gacy's own later admission, which makes it unverifiable. But psychiatrists took it seriously because he volunteered it against his own interest. He described climbing into a coffin one night with the body of a teenage boy and being disturbed, his word, by what he felt. He called his mother the next day and asked to come home. Whatever precisely occurred in Las Vegas, the timeline is documented. Within 3 months of the mortuary job, Gacy returned to Chicago, and something in his trajectory changed. The drifting stopped. The construction of the public John Wayne Gacy, the achiever, the joiner, the man everyone would vouch for, began almost immediately. He enrolled at Northwestern Business College and graduated in 1963, the first academic success of his life. He took a management trainee position with the Nunn-Bush Shoe Company, which transferred him to Springfield, Illinois in 1964. And in Springfield, the mask acquired its 2 most important components: a wife and a resume of civic virtue. He married Marlyn Myers, a co-worker, in September 1964. He joined the Springfield Jaycees, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, the era's premier organization for ambitious young businessmen, and threw himself into it with an intensity that colleagues found remarkable. He was named Key Man. He volunteered for everything. He worked by his own count and others 12 to 14 hours a day between the job and the club. The boy, who could not earn one man's approval, had found an entire institution that handed out approval in the form of plaques, and he set out to collect all of them. In 1966, the performance leveled up. Marlyn's father owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises in Waterloo, Iowa, and offered Gacy a management position. The couple moved. Gacy ran 3 restaurants, worked relentlessly, and repeated the Springfield formula in the Waterloo Jaycees: membership, committees, fundraising, awards. In 1967, he was named the chapter's outstanding vice president, and he was widely considered the favorite to become its next president. His wife gave birth to a son, then a daughter. From the outside, by early 1968, John Wayne Gacy was a 25-year-old family man, a business manager, a father of 2, and one of the most energetic civic figures in a mid-sized Iowa city. The outside was the only part anyone checked, because in Waterloo, for the first time in the documented record, the other Gacy was operating. He had opened his home's basement to teenage boys, many of them his own restaurant employees, offering alcohol, a pool table, and pornographic films. He called it a club. The grooming architecture was already professional grade: employment as leverage, alcohol as disinhibitor, isolation as opportunity, and his civic reputation as the wall no accusation could climb. In August 1967, he sexually assaulted Donald Voorhees, the 15-year-old son of a fellow Jaycee. Over the following months, he assaulted other boys, using the same combination of coercion, bribery, and threat. In March 1968, Voorhees told his father, and here, the record presents us with the first of the 6 moments this case turns on, the first time the system had John Wayne Gacy in its hands. Gacy was arrested and charged with sodomy. His response became the template for every future encounter with law enforcement: total, indignant denial, delivered with the fluency of a man who had spent his whole life performing. He claimed the accusation was political, a conspiracy by Jaycee's rivals to block his rise to the chapter presidency. He demanded a polygraph. He failed it. He demanded another. He failed that one too. Then, 4 months before trial, he paid an 18-year-old employee to physically attack Voorhees and intimidate him out of testifying. The attack failed, the boy was caught, and he told police who had hired him. Even his witness intimidation had witnesses. Confronted with a second felony charge, Gacy's strategy shifted with frictionless speed from denial to performance of contrition, another pattern that would repeat for the next decade. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy. He told the court psychiatrists what they expected to hear. The pre-sentencing evaluation at the psychopathic hospital of the State University of Iowa diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and stated, in language that reads today like prophecy, that he was unlikely to benefit from treatment and that his pattern of behavior would likely continue. The judge sentenced him to 10 years at the Anamosa State Penitentiary, the maximum. His wife divorced him. His father, and this detail matters more than any other for the psychological file, never visited, and the 2 men never spoke again. On Christmas Day, 1969, while Gacy sat in Anamosa, John Stanley Gacy died of cirrhosis. His son requested a supervised release to attend the funeral. The request was denied. People who knew Gacy said he never fully processed that closed door. The man whose approval he had chased for 27 years died while he was in a cell, with the ledger permanently unsettled. Whatever restraint the pursuit of his father's approval had imposed on him died in that moment too. And inside the prison, the mask performed better than it ever had outside. Gacy was, by institutional consensus, a model inmate. He ran the prison kitchen. He earned his high school diploma. He completed 16 college-level courses. He organized, and this is documented not legend, a Jaycee's chapter inside Anamosa, recruiting hundreds of members and lobbying for improvements to prison facilities, including the installation of a miniature golf course in the recreation yard. Parole boards evaluate what they can see. What they could see was the most productive, most cooperative, most institutionally decorated prisoner in the facility. What they could not see was the Iowa psychiatric report sitting in his file, stating plainly that this man's disorder did not respond to good behavior, because good behavior was its primary symptom. On June 18, 1970, after serving 18 months of a 10-year maximum sentence, John Wayne Gacy walked out of Anamosa on parole. He was 28 years old. He had a felony conviction for a sexual crime against a child, a documented diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, a formal psychiatric prediction that he would reoffend, and a bus ticket to Chicago. Moment number one had come and gone. The system had held him for a year and a half, then handed him back, and the paperwork that explained exactly what he was would sit unread in Iowa while he rebuilt, 7 hours east, in a city that had no idea who was arriving. Within 8 months of stepping off that bus, a teenage boy in Chicago would walk into a police station and accuse John Wayne Gacy of sexual assault. What happened to that complaint, and what did not happen, is where the Chicago chapter of this case begins. Chicago in 1971 did not know John Wayne Gacy had ever left. That sentence is not rhetorical. It is the administrative truth at the center of this case. When Gacy returned to his mother's house on the north side in the summer of 1970, his Iowa conviction, his psychiatric diagnosis, and his parole conditions existed on paper in one state, while the man himself rebuilt his life in another. He was formally barred from contact with minors under the terms of his parole. There was no practical mechanism to enforce it. He enrolled in cooking school. He took a job as a chef at a restaurant called Bruno's. He was, once again, the hardest worker anyone had ever seen, and in February 1971, 8 months after his release, a teenage boy filed a complaint with Chicago police stating that Gacy had picked him up at the Greyhound bus terminal and attempted to force him into sex. This is the second of the 6 moments. Gacy was charged. A court date was set. The boy failed to appear, and the charge was dismissed. That is the entire record of the incident's consequences in Illinois. But the deeper failure is what happened next, or rather what did not. The Iowa Board of Parole, which held the authority to revoke Gacy's release for exactly this kind of allegation, was never notified of the arrest. A convicted child sex offender on active parole with a documented prediction of reoffense was arrested for an offense against a minor, and the two bureaucracies never spoke. 8 months later, in October 1971, Iowa formally discharged him from parole, closing his file as a success story. In 1972, his criminal record was sealed under Iowa's procedures for first-time offenders. On paper, John Wayne Gacy was now a man with no past at all. He immediately set about acquiring a future. In August 1971, with his mother's help, he purchased the house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in unincorporated Norwood Park Township. A detail of jurisdiction that will matter enormously later, because the address fell under the Cook County Sheriff's Police rather than the Chicago Police Department. One more seam in the patchwork he would slip through. It was a modest one-story brick ranch with a stone facade, a garage, and a crawl space beneath the floorboards, accessible through a trapdoor in a closet. His mother and sister helped him furnish it. Neighbors on the block, Lily and Edward Grexer among them, welcomed him within weeks, and would spend the next 7 years eating dinners at his table, celebrating holidays in his living room, and complaining year after year about a smell they could never place. Gacy told them it was moisture, a broken sewer pipe, dampness under the house. The Grexers believed him because there was no version of reality available to them in which the alternative was thinkable. In June 1972, he remarried Carol Hoff, a divorcee with 2 young daughters who had known him since his teens. She and her daughters moved into Summerdale. The suburban portrait was complete. Husband, stepfather, homeowner, host of legendary summer parties that drew hundreds of guests. In 1974, he gave the parties themes, a luau, a Western night, and the yearly gathering became a neighborhood institution. The following year, he founded his own business, PDM Contractors, painting, decorating, and maintenance, and the contractor phase of his life began. PDM's workforce policy was the grooming architecture from Waterloo, now legally incorporated. Gacy hired teenage boys, almost exclusively, and explained to anyone who asked that young workers kept labor costs down. It was an answer so economically sensible that no one ever asked the second question, and by the time PDM existed, John Wayne Gacy had already killed. The first murder predates the business, the second marriage, and very nearly the house's first anniversary. On January 2, 1972, 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy of Nebraska was passing through Chicago by Greyhound on his way home from visiting relatives with a layover until morning. Gacy met him at the terminal, the same terminal from the 1971 complaint, and offered the boy a place to sleep and a promise to return him in time for his bus. What happened the next morning is known only through Gacy's confession, and it is the single killing he ever described as unintentional. He claimed he woke to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway holding a kitchen knife, and that he attacked in perceived self-defense, stabbing the boy repeatedly, only to walk into the kitchen afterward and find the table set for 2 eggs and bacon laid out. McCoy had been making them breakfast. The knife in his hand was breakfast preparation. Whether that account is true, partially true, or a story Gacy constructed to make his first murder forgivable to himself, one detail of his confession is not disputed by the psychiatrists who heard it. He told them that in the moments of the killing, he experienced a release he compared to a drug, and that it was in that moment he understood, in his own words, that death was his true compulsion. He buried Timothy McCoy in the crawl space and poured concrete over the grave. The boy would not be identified until 1986, 14 years later, through dental records. Whatever threshold was crossed on that January morning, the record shows restraint afterward, or more precisely, it shows an absence of documented victims for roughly 2.5 years, the period overlapping his engagement and remarriage. Criminal psychologists reviewing the case have noted the pattern common to organized offenders: the compulsion submerged during periods when the performed life was new and demanding, then resurfaced as the performance stabilized. In the summer of 1975, it resurfaced permanently. In July of that year, Gacy killed his second known victim, a still unidentified young man estimated to be between 14 and 18 years old, and buried him in the crawl space. The killings would now continue with accelerating frequency until the week of his arrest. That same July brought the third of the 6 moments. And it is arguably the most damning of them all, because this time the complaint came with a name, an address, an employer relationship, and a furious family that would not let go. John Butkovich was 17, a PDM employee, a kid from the neighborhood who loved cars and was saving to restore his Dodge. On July 29, 1975, he confronted Gacy over 2 weeks of withheld back pay, a dispute witnessed by others. 2 days later, he vanished. His car was found parked near his apartment, keys in the ignition, his jacket and wallet inside. His parents went to the police immediately and told them exactly where to look. Their son had a pay dispute with his employer, John Gacy, and had gone to collect. Police interviewed Gacy. He acknowledged the boy had worked for him, acknowledged the pay dispute, denied any knowledge of the disappearance. That was sufficient. No search of the property, no follow-up. Marco and Delphine Butkovich did not accept it. Over the following 3 years they called the police, by their own late account, more than 100 times, asking them to look harder at John Gacy. More than 100 calls. Their son was under the garage floor at Summerdale the entire time. Consider what the system now held, scattered across its unconnected files: an Iowa conviction for sodomy against a minor, a psychiatric diagnosis predicting reoffense, a 1971 Chicago assault complaint by a teenage boy, dismissed, a 1975 missing persons case in which the last known conflict in the victim's life was with John Gacy, pressed by a family calling relentlessly for years. Any 2 of those documents placed side by side form a picture. No 2 of them were ever on the same desk. Inside the house on Summerdale, meanwhile, the marriage was disintegrating in ways Carol Hoff could describe but not decode. Gacy had grown volatile and unpredictable. He was staying out most of the night, offering explanations about work. She found wallets in the house that belonged to young men, identification cards that were not his. She found homosexual pornography in the garage. When she confronted him, he told her flatly that he preferred young men to women, a statement she absorbed without grasping its full dimension. And there was the smell, always the smell, which he blamed, to her as to the neighbors, on moisture beneath the house. At one point he had his teenage employees dig trenches down there, telling them it was for drainage pipes. He was having his future graves excavated by boys the same age as the ones already in them, and paying them an hourly wage to do it. Carol filed for divorce, and it was finalized on March 2nd, 1976. She moved out. The last person with daily access to the interior of that house was gone, and the arithmetic of the crawl space reflects it with terrible clarity. The killings that had come one at a time now became a campaign. In the 12 months following the divorce, John Wayne Gacy murdered at least 8 young men. His method had matured into a fixed sequence, and understanding it matters, not for its darkness, but because every stage of it was engineered around the same principle that governed his entire life: the gap between what a thing is and what it appears to be. The approach was recruitment or invitation, a job offer from a legitimate contractor, a drink, sometimes an impersonation of authority. He carried a spotlight on his black Oldsmobile and occasionally flashed a badge, playing policeman to boys with reasons to comply. At the house came alcohol, marijuana, the tour of the host's trophies, and then the pivot he was most proud of, the one he described to detectives with the showman's pride he never lost: the handcuff trick. Pogo the clown performed it at parties. He would cuff his own hands, twist and be free because he palmed the key. Then he would offer the cuffs to his guest. "Want to see if you can do it?" The victim, cuffed, would discover in a single sentence that the evening had never been what it appeared. Gacy would lean in and deliver the line he repeated, by his own confession, in almost the same words each time: "The trick is, you have to have the key." From that moment the young man was not a guest, but a captive, and what followed, the assaults, the torture, and finally what Gacy called his rope trick, a tourniquet twisted with a stick until it became a garrote, took place in a house that, from the street, was hosting nothing but another quiet evening. He sometimes recited the 23rd Psalm while doing it, then the trapdoor, the crawl space, the lime, and in the morning the contractor's schedule, the precinct meetings, the parties. It is here, in 1975, that the final and most infamous layer of the mask was added. Gacy joined the Jolly Joker Clown Club, a local group of amateur clowns who performed at charity events, hospitals, and parades. He designed his own characters, Pogo the clown and Patches, and painted his own face. Professional clowns, who later reviewed photographs of his makeup, noted a detail that has since entered the folklore of the case, but is factually documented. Gacy painted the corners of his mouth sharp and pointed, where professional clowns round them off so as not to frighten children. He performed at children's parties. He marched in the Polish Constitution Day parade. And in 1978, through his Democratic Party volunteer work, he had risen to precinct captain, directing hundreds of neighborhood residents on election matters. He was photographed shaking hands with First Lady Rosalind Carter, who signed the photo with warm regards. On the day that photograph was taken, there were more than 25 bodies beneath his house. The Secret Service had cleared him for proximity to the First Lady of the United States. His sealed Iowa file said nothing to anyone, ever. The victims accumulating beneath the floorboards shared a profile, and the profile explains the silence. They were boys and young men between roughly 14 and 21. Many were PDM employees. Others were runaways, hitchhikers, or young men Gacy found in the Greyhound station or on the streets of the uptown neighborhood. Kids adrift in a decade that produced them in numbers. Kids whose disappearances generated no headlines, and in many cases, no missing persons report at all. Some had families who assumed they had simply moved on. Some had families who reported them and were told, in the language of the era, that runaways come back. Gacy understood this demographic mathematics perfectly, and said so after his arrest with a coldness that still defines him. He described some of his victims as worthless little queers and punks, human beings whose absence he had correctly calculated. The world was structured not to notice, but not all of them fit that calculation. Some had jobs, homes, families waiting for them at dinner tables. Gregory Godzik, 17, a PDM employee, vanished in December 1976 after dropping his date at her home. His car was found abandoned, and his parents, like the Butkoviches before them, pointed police directly at his employer. Gacy told the family the boy had run away, and then, with a flourish that measures the depth of his confidence, told them Gregory had left a message on his answering machine after disappearing. The Godziks asked to hear it. He said he had erased it. John Sick, 19, vanished in January 1977. He was not an employee, but his Plymouth satellite subsequently appeared in Gacy's possession, sold through PDM paperwork, and when another of Gacy's young employees was later stopped by police in that same car and questioned about it, the trail led to Gacy, who explained smoothly that Syke had sold him the vehicle before leaving town. A dead teenager's car, transferred through the suspect's own business records, examined by police, and the file closed on the strength of the suspect's word. Moment number 4 had come and gone so quietly that no one involved understood it had been a moment at all. By the autumn of 1977, the crawl space was approaching capacity, and Gacy's response was not to stop, but to change disposal methods. The detail that, more than any other, refutes the notion of a man losing control. He was managing logistics. The later victims went into the Des Plaines River, dropped from the I-55 bridge at night on his drives home. 5 bodies would eventually be pulled from those waters. The killing pace in 1977 alone, at least 7 young men. And in March 1978 came the encounter that should have been the 5th moment and became instead a preview of the finale. A 26-year-old named Jeffrey Rignall, who survived. What Rignall survived, what he did about it, and how close his one-man investigation came to ending everything 9 months early, that is where the collapse begins. Jeffrey Rignall remembered the car. That detail would matter more than anything the police did. On the night of March 21, 1978, Rignall, 26 years old, visiting Chicago, was walking to a bar in the Newtown neighborhood when a heavy-set man in a black Oldsmobile pulled alongside and offered him a ride and a joint. Inside the car, the man pressed a chloroform-soaked rag over his face. Rignall regained consciousness in a house he did not know, restrained, and was tortured and raped over a period of hours, repeatedly chloroformed into unconsciousness whenever he resisted. And then, for reasons that remain one of the unresolved questions of the case, he was not killed. He woke at dawn in Lincoln Park, fully dressed, face burned by the chloroform, with his money gone, but his life inexplicably returned to him. He staggered to his girlfriend's apartment and then to a hospital, where doctors found the chloroform had permanently damaged his liver and burned his face and lungs. He went to the Chicago police, and here is the 5th moment in its entirety. Rignall could not name his attacker or provide an address, and the report, categorized as an assault with no suspect, went nowhere. What distinguishes this moment from the previous 4 is what the victim did about it. Rignall rented a car and, with his girlfriend, staked out the highway exits along the route he half remembered through the chloroform fog, the Kennedy Expressway, the Cumberland exit, for days, sitting there, watching traffic, until the black Oldsmobile passed. He followed it to 8213 West Summerdale Avenue and wrote down the license plate. The car and the house belonged to John Wayne Gacy. Rignall took the name to the police in April. A warrant was slow, Officers noted the jurisdictional seam. The address sat outside city limits. When Gacy was finally arrested on the complaint in July 1978, the charge filed was misdemeanor battery. He was released, and the case was still pending, scheduled for a hearing when the events of December made it irrelevant. A torture survivor had personally identified the man, his car, and his house 8 months before the end, and the system had processed it as a misdemeanor between 2 adults. Inside the crawl space, as Rignall sat outside photographing the driveway, there were at least 28 bodies. The murders continued through the summer and autumn of 1978. Frank landing in November, his body recovered from the Des Plaines River. James Mazzara, 5 days after Thanksgiving, into the river as well, because the crawl space, Gacy later explained with the contractor's practicality, had run out of room. And then, on the evening of December 11th, 1978, John Wayne Gacy made the mistake that every organized offender's profile predicts and none believes will apply to him. He deviated from his victim selection. He took a boy who would be missed within the hour. Robert Piest was 15 years old, an honor student, a gymnast, from a close, attentive family in Des Plaines, a suburb northwest of the city. He worked evenings at Nissan Pharmacy. That night, his mother, Elizabeth, it was her birthday, arrived at the pharmacy at closing time to drive him home. Robert asked her to wait a few minutes. A contractor who had done remodeling work at the store had mentioned a summer job paying nearly double his pharmacy wage, and he wanted to talk to him. He walked out the door into the December cold to speak with the contractor. He never came back. His mother waited in the store, at first patient, then confused, then, with the speed of a family whose children do not simply vanish, alarmed. Within 3 hours, the Piest family had searched the area, and by that same night, Robert was reported missing to the Des Plaines police. The report landed on the desk of Lieutenant Joseph Kozenchak, head of detectives, and this, after 6 years and 5 squandered moments, is where the case finally met an investigator who did the elementary thing. Kozenchak asked the pharmacy's owner which contractor had been in the store that evening. The answer was John Gacy of PDM Contractors. Kozenchak ran the name through records, and Iowa answered. The sealed juvenile-style protections had limits. The sodomy convictions surfaced. A missing 15-year-old, last seen leaving to talk to a man with a prior conviction for a sexual crime against a teenage boy. Kozenchak drove to Summerdale Avenue the next day. Gacy performed. He acknowledged being at the pharmacy, denied speaking with any boy, and declined to come to the station that night with a story about a family death requiring his attention. A story that happened to be true, an uncle, and Gacy deployed the grief with practiced timing. When he did appear for questioning, he was indignant, cooperative in tone, and empty in substance, the same performance that had dissolved the Butkovich inquiry, the Godzik inquiry, the Sich inquiry, the Voorhees case until the polygraphs. But Kozenchak did something none of his predecessors had done. He declined to be reassured. The Iowa record, the pharmacy timeline, and the demeanor added up wrong, and on December 13th, he obtained a search warrant for the house. That first search, in hindsight, is agonizing to read. Officers took away items that would all matter later, a 1975 high school class ring engraved with initials that were not Gacy's, driver's licenses belonging to other people, handcuffs, books on pederasty, clothing too small for the homeowner, a receipt from Nissan Pharmacy for a roll of film, made out to a co-worker of Robert Piest. They opened the trapdoor to the crawl space, shined a light across the dirt, noted the smell, attributed per the homeowner to a broken sewer line, and closed it. The evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. The ring and licenses could be explained away, and Gacy explained them away. Piest was not in the house. There was not yet probable cause for arrest. But Kozenczak made the decision that ended it. Rather than close the file on the suspect's word, he assigned 2 rotating teams of detectives to open, continuous, 24-hour surveillance of John Wayne Gacy. What followed was a 12-day psychological duel, unlike anything else in the case file. Gacy, who had spent his life performing for audiences, now had a permanent one, and the performance grew florid. He invited the surveillance detectives to breakfast. He bought them meals, joked with them, invited 2 of them into his house, where one of them, standing in the hallway as the furnace kicked on and pushed air up through the vents, registered a smell he recognized from previous duty and would later describe in one flat, spare sentence, the smell of death. Gacy hired lawyers and filed a civil suit against the Des Plaines police for harassment, demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars, the mask, even now, choosing offense. But the structure under it was failing in observable increments. He was drinking heavily, driving erratically at speeds the tailing officers had to break traffic laws to match, visibly deteriorating, unshaven, rambling. Meanwhile, the investigation compounded daily. The film receipt tied the house to the pharmacy on the night of the disappearance. The class ring traced to John Sick. Missing since January 1977, the Sick car sale surfaced. Former PDM employees told detectives about the trenches they had been paid to dig in the crawl space. On December 20th, one of Gacy's own lawyers, Sam Amirante, sat with his client through a long night in which Gacy, exhausted and drinking, delivered what amounted to a rambling confession, telling him, among other things, that he had been judge, jury, and executioner of many people. Amirante, bound by privilege, could say nothing. The next morning, Gacy gave a marijuana cigarette to one of the surveillance officers, and that trivial act, delivery of a controlled substance, gave police the clean arrest they needed while the second search warrant was finalized. On December 21st, 1978, investigators returned to 8213 West Summerdale with a warrant specifically for the crawl space. Cook County Sheriff's evidence technician Daniel Jaycee went down through the trapdoor with a trenching tool, moved to the southwest area, and began to dig. Within minutes he struck what he first took to be a knee bone, then found human hair. He called up through the floorboards to the detectives above him, and the sentence he used, later entered into the record, was that they could charge Gacy with murder. The digging that began that afternoon did not fully end until the following spring. 26 bodies were recovered from the crawlspace. 3 more were found elsewhere on the property, under the garage, where John Butkovich had lain through every one of his parents' 100 phone calls, under the recreation room, and beneath the concrete of the patio. With the 4 victims recovered from the Des Plaines River, the total stood at 33. Robert Piest was not among the bodies in the house. Gacy had killed him within hours of the pharmacy, kept the body briefly, and taken it to the river. The boy who broke the case was recovered from the Illinois River in April 1979, 130 days after his mother watched him walk out of the pharmacy on her birthday. Confronted with the excavation, Gacy confessed, in a marathon session spanning many hours, with a fluency that unsettled even veteran investigators. He drew them a diagram of the crawl space from memory, marking grave locations like a site plan, the contractor documenting his own project. He described the handcuff trick, the rope trick, the Bible verses, the lime, the trenches. He estimated his own total at 33, but conceded he might have lost count, and threaded through the confession from the first hour was the architecture of his defense. It was not him. It was Jack, an alternate personality, Jack Handley, a name borrowed from a real acquaintance who committed the murders while John slept. Detectives noted that Jack appeared and disappeared from the narrative with suspicious convenience, present for the killings, absent whenever Gacy recounted the planning, the burials, the cover stories, all of which he narrated in the first person with perfect recall. The trial opened on February 6, 1980, in Cook County, before Judge Louis Garippo, and it was never about what happened. The confession, the diagram, and 29 bodies recovered from the defendant's own property had settled that. It was about a single legal question, sane or insane. The defense psychiatrists testified to multiple personality disorder, to psychosis, to a man not responsible for Jack's actions. The prosecution, led by William Kunkel, dismantled the claim with the case's own logistics. The trenches dug in advance by paid employees, the lime purchased. The disposal method changed when space ran out. The 6 years of successful deception of police in 3 jurisdictions, the victims selected for their invisibility. Insanity does not pre-dig its graves. The state called witnesses whose cumulative testimony reconstructed the pattern, including Jeffrey Rignall, who, as a defense witness, became one of the trial's most harrowing moments, breaking down so completely while describing the torture that he vomited and had to be escorted from the courtroom. His testimony cutting against the notion of an irresistible compulsion in ways neither side fully controlled. On March 12, 1980, the jury deliberated less than 2 hours before convicting John Wayne Gacy of 33 counts of murder. At that time, the most murder convictions ever returned against one individual in United States history. After a brief sentencing phase, 12 of the murders, those committed after Illinois reinstated capital punishment, brought a sentence of death. Gacy spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center and spent them entirely in character. He recanted the confession. He claimed he had been out of town for many of the murders, that PDM employees with keys to the house were responsible, that he was the 34th victim. He gave interviews. He took collect calls from true crime enthusiasts. And he painted clowns mostly, Pogo in oils, self-portraits in grease paint that collectors bought and celebrities acquired, and some victims' families later purchased at auction for the sole purpose of burning them in a bonfire. Every appeal failed. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. Asked for his final words, the man who had recited scripture over dying boys chose 4. A profane taunt, "Kiss my ass." Outside the prison walls, a crowd numbering in the hundreds cheered when the death was announced. And the case refused to close, because the count was never really 33. It was 33 bodies, and 8 of them had no names. In 2011, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart reopened the identification effort, exhuming remains and applying DNA technology that had not existed in 1979. The results have arrived at the pace of genealogy. William George Bundy, identified in 2011. James Byron Hackinson, 16 years old, from Minnesota, identified in 2017 after his family submitted DNA. Francis Wayne Alexander, identified in 2021 through forensic genetic genealogy. A young man whose family had never filed a report because they believed he simply wanted nothing more to do with them. He had been dead in the crawl space since about 1976. Detective Sergeant Jason Moran, who leads the effort, has framed the work in a sentence that stands as the inversion of everything Gacy calculated. It is about the victims, about providing answers, not headlines. 3 of the 8 have been named. 5 young men, recovered from that house more than 47 years ago, are still waiting. Facial reconstructions of 2 of them, John Doe 10, 17 to 21 years old with a healed clavicle injury, John Doe 13, 18 to 21 with wavy dark brown hair, remain published by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the standing hope that someone, somewhere, recognizes a brother or an uncle who went to Chicago in the 1970s and never wrote home, which returns us finally to the question this case was always about, not who John Wayne Gacy was, but how he was possible. Line up the 6 moments one last time. Iowa, 1968. Convicted, diagnosed, his own evaluation predicting reoffense, paroled in 18 months for good behavior, when good behavior was the diagnosis. Chicago, 1971. Arrested on a boy's complaint that died when the witness failed to appear, with Iowa never told. Butkovich, 1975. A named suspect, a motive, 100 phone calls from the family, no search. Jaycee's car, 1977. A missing teenager's vehicle in the suspect's business records, closed on his word. Rignall, 1978. A surviving victim who did the police work himself, delivered a name and address, filed as a misdemeanor. Each failure has an individual explanation, jurisdiction, evidence, thresholds, resources, era, but the aggregate has only one explanation, and Gacy himself stated it, in the sentence that may be the truest thing he ever said. Asked how he got away with it for so long, he answered that they were looking for a monster, and he was a Jaycee. The clown makeup was never the disguise. The disguise was the handshake, the precinct list, the barbecue, the Man of the Year plaque. Gacy did not hide from his community. He let his community build the hiding place for him, one act of trust at a time. And the lesson of the crawl space is not that a monster lived on Summerdale Avenue. It is that 33 young men died over 6 years within reach of a system that held every piece of the answer and never once assembled it. He lived among us. They always do. The only question the dead leave behind is whether we have learned to look at the ones who smile. If this case stayed with you, subscribe. The next one is already on the desk. And if anything in this story reminded you of a young man who left for Chicago in the 1970s and never came back, the Cook County Sheriff's Office is still listening. 5 of them are still waiting for their names.